Imagine the vast, sun-scorched lands of northeastern Africa more than 5,000 years ago. Along the narrow green ribbon of the Nile River, a miracle was quietly unfolding. This wasn't yet the land of pyramids or golden tombs, but something far more important was being born: civilization itself. Around 3100 BC, a transformation took root that would shape one of the greatest empires in human history. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, often credited to a semi-mythical king named Narmer or Menes, marked the beginning of the First Dynasty and the emergence of Egypt's first true cities. These weren't cities in the modern sense: no skyscrapers, no noise, no industry, but they were bustling centers of administration, ritual, and trade. They represented a monumental shift from small, scattered farming villages to organized hierarchical societies with centralized leadership. The Nile became not just a source of life, but a highway of power. The first cities, like Hierakonpolis, Abydos, and later Memphis, grew out of religious centers and trade hubs. They were surrounded by mud brick walls, packed with small homes, workshops, and the palaces of elite leaders. These early cities weren't built just for living, they were built for ruling. In these cities, society began to stratify. At the top, the pharaoh, seen as both a political leader and a living god. Below him were priests, scribes, artisans, and farmers, each playing a role in maintaining the delicate balance of Mat, the cosmic order the Egyptians believed governed all life. The people of these cities lived in simple, one- or two-room houses made of mud brick. Their days were ruled by the sun and the river, by planting cycles and flooding seasons. Yet despite this simplicity, they had rich cultural lives: music, games, jewelry, and daily rituals to honor gods like Ra, Horus, and Osiris. And at the heart of it all was writing. By 3100 BC, the Egyptians had begun developing hieroglyphic writing. It began as a system for recording offerings and taxes, but quickly evolved into something more. With writing came the recording of law, myth, and history. The scribes, those few who could read and write, became the keepers of memory and power. They etched names onto stone slabs, recorded harvests on papyrus scrolls, and preserved sacred texts in temple libraries. These early records give us insight into the daily life and complex beliefs of ancient Egyptians, how they viewed death, the gods, nature, and each other. In early cities, the temple was not just a religious building. It was the city's heartbeat, its spiritual, economic, and administrative core. Temples stored grain, collected taxes, employed workers, and channeled the divine authority of the pharaoh. Nearby, elaborate tombs for rulers and nobles began to appear. Though the pyramids were still centuries away, early mastaba tombs showed the importance of the afterlife in Egyptian thinking. Death was not an end, but a transition one that required careful planning, sacred rituals, and physical offerings. The belief in life after death shaped everything from the layout of homes to the organization of the state. Preparing for eternity was a lifelong concern, especially for the elite. The unification of Egypt under a single ruler brought about one of the first true bureaucracies in human history. Officials were appointed to oversee irrigation, grain storage, tax collection, and temple rituals. These early administrators became the backbone of Egypt's power, and many lived in the cities that sprang up along the Nile. This system allowed Egypt to survive and even thrive in a harsh desert climate. With careful planning, the cities stored food during good years and rationed it during bad ones. The annual inundation of the Nile became the pulse of Egyptian life, and the pharaoh was seen as the one who maintained its rhythm. Life in the earliest Egyptian cities was humble, but structured. Most people lived in small, flat-roofed mud brick houses with few possessions, perhaps a reed mat, some clay pots, and a small shrine to household gods. Windows were narrow to keep out the heat, and rooftops were often used as sleeping spaces during hot nights. The morning began early, often before sunrise. Farmers walked to the edge of the floodplains to tend crops. Women baked bread, brewed beer, and cared for children. Scribes opened scrolls to begin their clerical work. Priests bathed and dressed statues of gods with perfumes and linens. The city breathed as a single organism, each person fulfilling their sacred role. Though society was hierarchical, it was not static. A talented scribe or craftsman could gain status and wealth. Social mobility, while limited, was possible through education and loyalty to the pharaoh's administration. At the base of the social pyramid were farmers, who made up the majority of the population. Their lives were intimately tied to the rhythms of the Nile. After the flood receded each year, it left behind rich black siltkamet, the black land, perfect for growing wheat, barley, flax, and vegetables. Farming was a communal effort. Water was shared through irrigation canals maintained by workers under local overseers. But when fields lay under water during the flood season, the state mobilized these same farmers to build walls, roads, canals, and even tombs for their rulers. These massive labor projects weren't always forced slavery. As many imagined, they were often a form of national duty and even spiritual honor. Next came artisans, metalworkers, stonemasons, potters, carpenters, and jewelers. Working in city workshops, many were attached to temples or royal estates. Their craftsmanship was exquisite. Even in this early period, Egyptians produced gold amulets, painted ceramics, and carved statues that still inspire awe. A lavish dining scene depicting nobles enjoying a banquet, with rich decorations and sumptuous food on the table, detailed background. At the top were officials, nobles, and of course, the pharaoh. These elites lived in larger houses, wore fine linen, and dined on more luxurious food goose, figs, beer, and wine. But even they lived humbly by modern standards. The power of Egypt was not displayed in private wealth, but in monuments, rituals, and cosmic order. Unlike many ancient societies, Egypt gave women surprising levels of agency. In these early cities, women could own property, inherit land, divorce, engage in business, and appear in court. Some even rose to become priestesses, scribes, or estate managers. Their primary roles, however, were domestic. A woman's honor was tied to fertility, household order, and her ability to manage servants and production of food and textiles. Yet art from this period often shows husbands and wives side by side, not as master and servant, but as partners in life and death. The goddess Isis, associated with motherhood and magical protection, was widely venerated. She became a model of ideal femininity, powerful, wise, nurturing, and loyal. Even in these early centuries, Egyptian art displayed a stunning clarity of vision. Wall paintings, pottery, and sculpture followed strict visual rules. Profile heads, frontal torsos, almond eyes, and stylized hands created a timeless aesthetic one meant to transcend mortality. Art was not decorative. It was functional, tied to religious purpose and eternal truth. To draw a person, or God, was to give them existence in the afterlife. Thus, artists were not creative in a modern sense. They were guardians of spiritual form. In cities, you would find art on tomb walls, in household shrines, on tools and furniture. Even a simple pot might carry an offering scene or a protective spell. Everything had symbolic meaning, from the color of paint to the direction a figure faced. Though not capitalist by any means, early Egyptian cities had a complex redistribution economy. Farmers gave surplus grain to temples and state officials, who stored it in great granaries. In return, people received rations, tools, linen, and sometimes luxury goods. Markets were lively places. Bartering was common: wheat for fish, beer for sandals, copper for linen. Money as we know it didn't exist yet. Instead, grain was the primary unit of value. Artisans sold their goods, and women often acted as local vendors of pottery, food, and textiles. Foreign trade also began to flourish. From Nubia, Egyptians brought gold, ivory, and exotic animals. From the Sinai, they mined turquoise and copper. Trade routes extended to the Levant and possibly even Mesopotamia. These early cities were not isolated. They were interconnected hubs of a growing regional network. Though temples dominated the skyline, religion in ancient cities was not limited to the elite. Every home had a household shrine, often with small statues of protective deities like Base or Toret. Families offered food, burned incense, and spoke prayers to ensure health and good fortune. People lived with the sacred, woven into the ordinary. A fish caught in the Nile might be seen as a gift from the god Hapi. A healthy child might be attributed to Hathor's blessing. Dreams were believed to carry divine messages. Illness could be treated with both herbs and spells. This fusion of faith and practicality made the Egyptian city not just a place to live, but a place to live in harmony with the gods. In ancient Egyptian cities, the temple was more than a religious site. It was the spiritual engine, the economic headquarters, and the symbol of divine order. Temples like those at Hierakonpolis, Abydos, and later Memphis stood not merely as places of worship, but as manifestations of the cosmos on earth. To enter a temple was to cross the boundary between human time and sacred eternity. Colonnaded halls, open courtyards, and dark inner sanctuaries were laid out in symbolic alignment with celestial bodies, especially the sun. Every stone, every relief, every scent of incense was calculated to maintain the cosmic balance. The Egyptians revered above all. Temples were also economic powerhouses. They owned vast tracts of land, employed thousands of workers, and stored wealth in the form of grain, gold, and livestock. Farmers gave a portion of their harvest as offerings. Artisans labored in temple workshops. Scribes recorded every donation with meticulous care. In this way, religion and economy were not separate spheres, they were intertwined. At the apex of Egyptian society stood the pharaoh, mortal man, yet believed to be the incarnation of Horus, son of the sun god Ra, and the divine guarantor of order. In the earliest cities, the pharaoh was not merely a ruler, but the axis mundi, the bridge between earth and sky. His word was law. His presence ensured the Nile would flood, the sun would rise, and chaos would be kept at bay. He led rituals, offered sacrifices, and built monuments not for vanity, but to sustain the cosmos. Without the pharaoh, the Egyptians believed, the world would descend into disordersfit, the dreaded opposite of Mat. But the pharaoh could not rule alone. As Egypt expanded, a centralized administration emerged. Viziers, governors, and high priests managed cities, collected taxes, and supervised building projects. These elites often lived in city palaces or temple quarters, forming the bureaucratic core of the urban landscape. Early Egyptian cities were not built haphazardly. They were designed with a vision rooted in religion, hierarchy, and geography. Most cities arose along the east bank of the Nile, symbolically aligned with the rising sun life, rebirth, and divine power. The layout reflected spiritual logic. Temples occupied the city center, or its highest ground, symbolizing divine authority. Palaces and elite estates were nearby, signifying the pharaoh's closeness to the gods. Administrative buildings and workshops clustered around these sacred cores. Residential districts stretched outward, sometimes in tight, narrow streets, sometimes in ordered rows, depending on the era and the planner. Cities were often surrounded by walls of mud brick, not just for protection, but to mark the boundary between order and wilderness, civilization and chaos. Gateways were sacred thresholds, watched over by deities in carved relief. Egyptian architecture was defined by practicality, symbolism, and permanence. Mud brick was the most common building material, abundant, cheap, and easy to use. Ordinary homes, granaries, workshops, and even some palaces were made from it. But temples and royal tombs, they demanded stone, limestone, sandstone, granite. Stone was eternal, just like the gods they honored. In cities, you'd see flat-roofed houses, often 2 stories, clustered tightly together. Courtyards where families cooked, worked, and worshipped. Streets unpaved, but worn smooth by generations of sandals. Public buildings with colonnades, open squares, and carved doorways. Even in this early period, Egyptian architecture showed a sense of monumentality, a desire to impress, to endure, to speak across centuries. Many cities and temples were oriented to celestial events, especially the rising and setting of the sun at solstices and equinoxes. This wasn't accidental. Egyptians believed in a universe ordered by number, proportion, and rhythm. City builders and priests used sacred geometry to align temples with stars like Sirius, whose appearance in the sky marked the beginning of the Nile flood. The layout of a temple was not just practical, it mirrored the cosmic journey of the sun, from east to west, from birth to death, from chaos to order. Every measurement had symbolic meaning. The height of columns, the number of statues, the length of corridors, all were tied to myth and math. This mathematical mysticism gave Egyptian cities a quality of sacred coherence. You didn't just live in a city, you lived inside a symbol. Around the end of the First Dynasty, Egypt's early rulers established Memphis as their capula, a decision that would shape the course of Egyptian history for centuries. Military control and religious symbolism. Its full name was embedding, the White Walls, referring to the bright enclosure wall of its royal compound. Memphis became a cosmopolitan center. Artisans, priests, bureaucrats, foreign envoys, and merchants all converged here. The Temple of Ptah, the creator god and patron of craftsmen, dominated the city's spiritual life. It was said that the heart and tongue of Ptah shaped the world, just as the words of the pharaoh shaped Egypt. Urban life in Egypt was shaped not only by the needs of the living, but also by the expectations of the dead. The concept of the afterlife was so integral to society that much of a city's labor force and wealth was dedicated to preparing for it. Near cities rose the first necropolises, cities of the dead, with mastaba tombs made of mud brick, often arranged in geometric rows. These weren't just burial plots, they were eternal homes, complete with furniture, food offerings, and painted scenes of daily life. In death, the elite hoped to continue living as they had, in life surrounded by luxury, order, and divine favor. Urban Egyptians visited family tombs, left offerings, and read spells aloud to guide loved ones into the next world. For them, life and death were not opposites. They were phases of a sacred journey, both unfolding within the city's ritual landscape. In the heart of every great Egyptian city, beside its temples and palaces, there existed a quieter force, the House of Lifa, place where knowledge was stored, copied, and transmitted. These were not universities in the modern sense, but temple libraries and scriptoria where priests and scribes studied medicine, astronomy, law, ritual, and sacred literature. The scribe was the gatekeeper of knowledge and one of the most respected members of urban society. Trained from a young age, often in temple schools, he spent years learning to master over 700 hieroglyphs and later forms of script like hieratic. Writing was not merely a skill, it was a sacred art, a gift from Thoth, the god of wisdom. Scribes recorded the lifeblood of the city. Tax records, trade agreements, legal disputes, harvest yields, temple donations, festival calendars, and even private letters. Without scribes, a city could not function. They were the invisible architects of urban life, and they were more than record keepers. Many scribes became scholars, doctors, and philosophers studying the world with a blend of observation, ritual, and intuition. In the ancient Egyptian worldview, science and religion were never separate. Observing the stars, treating a wound, calculating the volume of a grain silage was done in the service of Mat, the divine order. Egyptian astronomers charted the heavens not for abstract curiosity, but to align temples, predict the Nile flood, and regulate religious festivals. The rising of Sirius, the dog star, was particularly important. It announced the beginning of the inundation and the Egyptian New Year. Time itself was a sacred rhythm. Cities kept calendars based on both lunar cycles and solar movements. Priests used shadow clocks, water clocks, and star charts to determine precise ritual timings. Urban life, from temple openings to market schedules, flowed with celestial regularity. Mathematics thrived in these early cities, especially for architecture and accounting. Egyptian engineers understood geometry, fractions, and volumes not abstractly but practically. They used ropes with fixed intervals to create right angles and perfect squares. They calculated crop yields, measured fields, and built straight canals through uneven terrain. Early Egyptian cities were home to some of the most sophisticated medical practices of the ancient world. Much of what we know comes from medical papyri, like the Edwin Smith and Ebers Scrolls documents that describe hundreds of ailments and treatments. Doctors, often trained in temple schools, combined rational techniques with ritual incantations. Illness was seen as both a physical imbalance and a spiritual disturbance. Treatments included herbal remedies made from garlic, honey, fig, and resin, surgical techniques like stitching wounds and setting broken bones, incantations to drive out malevolent spirits, protective amulets, and purification rituals. The best-known urban centers often had healing temples dedicated to gods like Sekhmet, goddess of plague and medicine, or Thoth, god of wisdom. Priests of these temples served as physicians, using dream interpretation and ritual baths alongside ointments and poultices. A patient in an ancient Egyptian city might receive both a compress of crushed herbs and a sacred chant whispered into their ear. To be healed was to be restored to harmony with Mat. If temples were the visible pillars of Egyptian cities, magic was the invisible thread binding everything together. Magic was not seen as fantasy or illusion, it was a force of nature, a divine technology gifted to humanity. Every city had magicians and ritualists who performed protective spells, curse reversals, fertility rites, and dream interpretations. Amulets were common, scarabs for rebirth, the Eye of Horus for protection, ankhs for vitality. Even architecture was magical. Doorways, walls, and columns often bore spells to ward off evil or call down blessings. The written word itself was considered magical. To write a god's name, or a formula from the Book of the Dead, was to activate divine power. Urban scribes were not just civil servants, they were technicians of the sacred, mediators between worlds. Magic extended into everyday life. A mother might whisper a charm over her child's cradle. A fisherman might bless his net with words from an old scroll. A dying noble might commission a spell to guide his soul across the stars. In ancient Egyptian cities, the supernatural was natural. Even as Egypt moved beyond the First Dynasty, the template of urban life established in 3100 BC remained remarkably consistent. The fusion of religion, administration, knowledge, and magic defined Egyptian cities for millennia. Later capitals like Thebes, Amarna, and Alexandria would build on this legacy. But the foundations were laid in the early dynastic period. These first cities established a vision of urbanism not as mere convenience, but as sacred theater where human life echoed divine order. The calculations made on scrolls of papyrus, the prayers whispered into starlit air, all were part of a city's greater purpose, to mirror the heavens on earth. Egyptian urbanism was not driven by expansion or empire, it was driven by meaning. The city was a cosmogram, a machine for aligning the mortal world with the eternal. What life was like in ancient Egypt? It was ordered, purposeful, deeply symbolic. Every stone laid, every field plowed, every word written was an act of cosmic participation. The rise of the first cities around 3100 BC did more than unify Egypt. It unified heaven and earth. In these sacred settlements, humans lived in rhythm with God's ancestors, stars, and the land. And though millennia have passed, though dynasties have crumbled and tombs have been plundered, the memory of these cities endures. In the pages of scrolls, in the lines of hieroglyphs, in the geometry of ruins, we still hear the heartbeat of the ancient city. In the worldview of ancient Egyptians, life and death were not opposites. They were intertwined phases in a single eternal cycle. And just as Egypt's first cities served the living administering justice, collecting taxes, honoring the gods, they also served the dead, who were considered active members of the city's ongoing spiritual economy. Every major city had its counterpart, a necropolis, or city of the dead, often located across the Nile on the west bank, where the sun set and the journey to the afterlife began. These necropolises weren't somber graveyards. They were sacred landscapes, carefully planned with tombs, chapels, offering tables, and processional routes for festivals of the dead. The boundary between the urban and the eternal was fluid. Living families visited tombs, left offerings, recited prayers. The dead, in turn, in this way, early Egyptian cities were never just cities. They were portals not only to power and order, but to immortality. From the First Dynasty onward, Egyptian elites built mastabast flat-roofed, rectangular tombs of mud brick, or stone as, eternal dwellings for the soul, or ka. These structures mimicked houses, complete with doors, furniture, and storage chambers. Carvings on the walls showed scenes of daily life, farming, feasting, fishing. The logic was simple and beautiful. To live forever, one must surround oneself with the essence of life. Tombs were built with geometric precision. Inscriptions and images were not decoration, they were magical technologies. Every hieroglyph activated a spell. Every offering scene ensured sustenance in the afterlife. Every alignment with the stars or cardinal directions helped guide the spirit toward the field of reeds. Inside these tombs were canopic jars, storing the internal organs of the deceased. Funerary goods included jewelry, pottery, tools, and Shabti figurines, tiny laborers who would serve the dead in the next world. Death was a journey, and no traveler left unprepared. While the grandest tombs were reserved for royalty and nobles, the belief in an afterlife gradually spread to commoners as well. In urban workshops, artisans began crafting affordable amulets, simple coffins, and painted funerary papyri for those of modest means. Urban priests offered funerary services on a sliding scale. Even if one couldn't afford a full tomb, a person might still have their name inscribed on a stela, or a small statue placed in a communal chapel. In this way, the city became a factory of eternity, producing the physical and spiritual goods necessary to sustain memory, identity, and divine connection long after death. And so Egyptian cities were not built only for power or comfort. They were built to last beyond the mortal span. They were built to be remembered. Egyptians viewed time in two ways: neha, the cyclical time of seasons and festivals, and Jet, the unchanging time of the gods and the dead. Urban life existed in both. The Nile flood was an eternal cycle: birth, growth, decay, rebirth. Cities followed this rhythm with markets, ceremonies, and seasonal construction projects. But beyond that lay Jet monuments, tombs, names carved in stone, meant to resist the flow of time and exist forever. Pharaohs built cities and temples not just to rule the present, but to project their names into eternity. The writing of a name, the recounting of deeds, the preservation of memory, these were acts of resistance against death. To live in the city was to be part of a sacred performance, to maintain order, uphold memory, and help time continue its sacred dance. Cities were not built randomly. Their cosmic geography mirrored the Egyptian vision of the universe. East was life, west was death. The Nile flowed between order and chaos, with the fertile black land hugging its banks and the desert red land stretching out beyond. The urban layout reflected this cosmic understanding. The main temple often faced the sunrise. The royal palace sat near the sacred lake or axis of processions. Tombs were set outside the city proper, but still within its spiritual domain. Even in how they arranged their streets and shrines, the Egyptians sought to bring heaven down to earth. When priests carried statues of gods through the streets during festivals, or when workers rebuilt temple walls in rhythmic unison, it was not just civic duty, it was ritual renewal. The city lived, not just in stone and flesh, but in sacred rhythm. By the end of the early dynastic period, around 2686 BC, the foundation of Egyptian urbanism was firmly established. The Great Pyramids had yet to rise. But the worldview that would sustain Egyptian culture for 3,000 years was already fully alive. The first cities gave birth to written language to preserve law, myth, and memory, religious architecture aligned with the stars, economic systems based on redistribution, labor, and seasonal cycles, sacred death culture that turned cities into bridges to the afterlife. What began as small ritual centers and trading hubs became the template of empire. The echoes of Memphis, Abydos, Hierakonpolis, and others would resonate through history, influencing not only the architecture of pyramids, but the logic of pharaohs, priests, and peasants alike. To walk through an ancient Egyptian city was to walk through a model of the universe. Every stone, every inscription, every offering spoke to the same sacred message. Life has order, death has purpose, and memory is a form of immortality. Today, we stand among the broken columns and sun-baked ruins of those first cities. Yet their spirit endures in the language of archaeology, in the myths they left behind, in the names still whispered by desert winds. They teach us that a city is not just a place. It is a vision of meaning, of time, of connection between the human and the divine. This is what life was like in ancient Egypt. This is what it meant to build a city that would never truly die.